Something is happening right now in Canada that should concern every single person watching this. And yet somehow it feels like most people aren't paying attention. I'm about to walk you through one of the most significant economic moments in recent Canadian history. And I need you to understand that this isn't about politics. This isn't about left versus right. And this isn't about who you voted for in the last election. This is about the future of your job, your business, your grocery bills, and the economic stability of an entire nation. What I'm going to share with you over these next segments might make you uncomfortable, it might make you angry, and it might make you question everything you were told over the past year. But I believe you deserve to know what's really going on because the mainstream conversation around this issue has been clouded by talking points, deflection, and frankly, a lot of confusion that seems almost intentional. So stay with me because by the end of this, you're going to see the situation with complete clarity and you're going to understand why so many people are starting to ask some very difficult questions about the direction this country is heading. Let me set the stage for you because context matters enormously here. We are now approaching a critical juncture in Canada's trade relationship with the United States. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that what happens in the coming months could reshape the Canadian economy for a generation. The trade agreement that governs most of our economic relationship with our largest trading partner is coming up for its scheduled review, and this was always going to happen. This review wasn't a surprise to anyone who was paying attention. It was written into the agreement from the very beginning, and every serious policy analyst, every trade expert, and every government official knew exactly when this moment would arrive. The question was never whether Canada would face this review, but rather how prepared we would be when that moment came. And that's where this story takes a troubling turn because the preparation, the positioning, and the strategic clarity that should have defined this period have been notably absent. Instead, what we've witnessed over the past year is something that looks a lot less like competent negotiation and a lot more like improvisation, mixed signals, and reactive decision making. Now, I want to be absolutely clear about something before we go any further, because I think it's important to establish what this conversation is and what it isn't. I'm not here to tell you that any one person or any one party is solely responsible for the complexities of international trade. These are genuinely difficult issues that would challenge any government, regardless of political stripe. Trade negotiations with a country 10 times your economic size are inherently challenging, and there are no easy answers or magic solutions. What I am here to tell you, however, is that the choices made over the past year have materially weakened Canada's position heading into these crucial discussions. That's not partisan rhetoric, that's not spin, and that's not me trying to score political points. That is simply the observable reality of where we stand right now compared to where we stood 12 months ago. The metrics that matter in these situations, things like credibility, consistency of messaging, clarity of objectives, and strategic positioning, have all deteriorated. And that deterioration didn't happen by accident or by some external force beyond our control. It happened through specific decisions, specific statements, and specific approaches that we can identify, examine, and evaluate. The reason I'm bringing this to you now is because I believe Canadians deserve to understand the full picture before the most consequential trade discussions of the decade begin in earnest. Too often, we only hear about these issues after the fact, when the deals are done and the consequences are already baked in. By then, it's too late to ask the hard questions, too late to demand accountability, and too late to push for a different approach. I don't want that to happen this time. I want you to be informed, I want you to be engaged, and I want you to be asking the right questions of the people who are supposed to be representing your interests at the negotiating table. Because make no mistake, what gets decided in these trade discussions will affect the price you pay for goods, the viability of industries across this country, the jobs available to your children and grandchildren, and the overall trajectory of Canadian prosperity for years to come. These aren't abstract policy debates happening in some distant capital. These are decisions that will land directly in your life, whether you're paying attention or not. Let me take you back to the beginning of this story because understanding how we got here is essential to understanding where we are now. When the current government took power, Canadians were presented with a very specific narrative, a very specific promise, and a very specific reason to believe that this leadership would be different. The world, we were told, had become more volatile, more transactional, and more dangerous than at any point in recent memory. International relationships that once operated on predictable norms and established protocols had given way to something more chaotic, more personality driven, and more unpredictable. And in this new environment, we were told that Canada needed a leader who understood not just politics, but markets, leverage, and the complex dynamics of high stakes negotiation. That was the pitch. That was the promise. And millions of Canadians bought into that vision because it sounded reasonable, it sounded competent, and it sounded like exactly what the moment required. The question we need to ask now, 1 year later, is whether that promise has been kept. The central challenge that was identified from the very beginning, the elephant in the room that everyone acknowledged, was the relationship with the United States under its current administration. This wasn't a hypothetical concern or a distant possibility that might or might not materialize. This was the defining challenge that everyone knew was coming, and it was explicitly addressed during the campaign and in the early months of the new government. Canadians were assured that this leadership possessed unique qualifications to handle this specific challenge. We were told that the experience, the expertise, and the understanding of how power and leverage work in international contexts would translate into effective management of this crucial relationship. That assurance mattered because it directly addressed the thing that most Canadians were worried about. It wasn't about ideology or domestic policy preferences. It was about competence in the face of a clear and present challenge to Canadian economic interests. Now, let me give you some numbers because I think it's important to understand just how significant this relationship is to everyday Canadian life. Somewhere between 70 and 75% of everything Canada exports goes to a single destination, and that destination is the United States. Think about that for a moment. 3/4 of our entire export economy depends on access to one market. Our supply chains are integrated with American supply chains. Our manufacturing sector is built around the assumption of relatively frictionless cross-border trade. Our agriculture industry, our energy sector, our automotive industry, and countless other parts of the Canadian economy are structurally dependent on predictable, stable access to the American market. This isn't a relationship of convenience that we can easily restructure or replace. This is the foundation upon which modern Canadian prosperity has been built. And any disruption to that foundation, any uncertainty about continued access, any erosion of the predictability that investors and businesses rely on has immediate and tangible consequences for Canadian workers, Canadian families, and Canadian communities from coast to coast. This economic reality is why the trade agreement matters so much and why the upcoming review is so consequential. The agreement that governs this relationship provides the rules, the frameworks, and the predictability that allow businesses to plan, invest, and hire with confidence. When that agreement is stable and when the relationship is well managed, investment flows into Canada because investors know what to expect. When that agreement is uncertain and when the relationship is poorly managed, investment hesitates, opportunities go elsewhere, and Canadian workers pay the price. So when Canadians went to the polls and chose this government, they weren't voting to avoid the challenges of this trade relationship. Those challenges were always going to be there regardless of who won the election. What they were voting for was competent management of those challenges. They were voting for the expertise, the steadiness, and the strategic acumen that they had been promised. They were voting for someone who could navigate the complexities and deliver outcomes that protected Canadian interests. That was the mandate. That was the expectation. And as we'll see, that mandate has not been fulfilled. I want to talk now about specific choices and specific actions, because this is where the abstract becomes concrete and where we can really evaluate what's happened over the past year. Early in this government's term, Canadians were told to expect a tough, assertive approach to trade relations with the United States. The message was clear. We would not be pushed around, we would not be intimidated, and we would respond to any aggressive moves with strength and determination. It sounded good. It sounded like exactly the kind of backbone that many Canadians wanted to see. And for a moment, it seemed like that approach might actually work. When tariffs were threatened by the American side, the response was to match them dollar for dollar, escalation for escalation, toughness for toughness. Canadians were told this was necessary to show that we couldn't be bullied, that we would stand firm, and that we would make the cost of targeting Canada high enough to deter future aggression. On paper, in press releases, and in political speeches, it was a compelling narrative. But here's what that narrative left out, and here's where the reality starts to diverge sharply from the rhetoric. The American economy is roughly 10 times the size of the Canadian economy. Let me say that again, because I really want it to sink in. 10 times. That means that in any tariff war between these two countries, the pain is not distributed equally. When Canada imposes tariffs on American goods, those tariffs are paid by Canadian consumers and Canadian businesses in the form of higher prices. Yes, there's some impact on the American side, particularly in border communities and in specific industries, but the aggregate effect on the American economy is marginal, while the aggregate effect on the Canadian economy is substantial. This isn't complicated economics. This is basic math. And anyone with genuine expertise in markets and trade should have understood this from the beginning. So what happened? What happened is exactly what basic economic logic would have predicted. The tariffs that were imposed with such fanfare, the ones that were supposed to demonstrate Canadian strength and resolve, were quietly dropped. Not because they achieved their strategic objectives, not because they forced concessions from the other side, not because they succeeded in any measurable way. They were dropped because they were hurting Canadians. They were raising the cost of living for Canadian families who were already struggling with inflation. They were adding costs to Canadian businesses that were already operating on thin margins. They were doing exactly what critics said they would do, which was punishing Canada more than they punished the United States. And so, without much acknowledgement and without much explanation, the policy was reversed. The tariffs came off, the tough talk subsided, and we moved on to the next news cycle as if nothing had happened. But something did happen, and this is the part that I really need you to understand. In negotiations, credibility is everything. Your counterpart across the table is constantly evaluating whether your threats are real, whether your commitments are solid, and whether your stated positions reflect your actual bottom line. When you make a big public show of escalation and then back away from it, you're not demonstrating pragmatism, you're demonstrating weakness. You're showing the other side that your threats are hollow, that your resolve is limited, and that if they just wait you out, you'll eventually fold. That's the message that was sent, not just to trade negotiators, but to everyone watching. Canada blinked. Canada backed down. Canada couldn't sustain the position it had so loudly proclaimed, and that loss of credibility doesn't disappear when the news cycle moves on. It sits there in the background, affecting every subsequent interaction and negotiation. The other side remembers, the other side factors it into their calculations, and the other side adjusts their approach accordingly, knowing that Canadian threats may not be as credible as they once seemed. The tariff reversal was damaging, but it wasn't the only problem. What came next might actually be worse in terms of long-term positioning. And that's the complete chaos in messaging that has defined this government's approach to trade over the past year. Let me walk you through what Canadians have been told at various points. And I want you to pay attention to how these statements contradict each other, because the contradictions reveal something important about the underlying confusion in our approach. At certain points, we were told that negotiations were going well, that a deal was close, that we might have something wrapped up by the summer. At other points, we were told that the parties were far apart, that major obstacles remained, and that any new deal might not be as favorable as what we already had. At still other points, we were told that the existing agreement was already excellent, better than what any other country had achieved, and that we should be proud of our position. And then, most remarkably of all, we were told that no deal might actually be better than a bad deal. Now stop and think about what that last statement means, because it's really quite extraordinary. Canada a country where three-quarters of exports go to a single market, a country whose entire economic structure is built around integrated North American supply chains, is being told by its own government that maybe we don't actually need a deal with that market. That's not a negotiating position. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of Canadian economic reality. Or worse, it's an attempt to prepare Canadians for failure by lowering expectations so dramatically that anything short of complete collapse can be spun as a success. When senior voices associated with the government start musing publicly about how Canada got along just fine before free trade began decades ago, that's not a history lesson. That's a trial balloon. That's testing how Canadians might react to the idea that predictability and stable market access aren't really that important after all. The problem with all this mixed messaging isn't just that it confuses Canadian citizens, although it certainly does that. The real problem is that it confuses the negotiating dynamic and undermines whatever leverage Canada might otherwise have. Effective negotiation requires clarity of objectives and consistency of communication. Your counterpart needs to understand what you want, what you're willing to accept, and what you're absolutely not willing to accept. When your messaging is all over the map, when you're simultaneously saying that a deal is close and that no deal is fine, when you're praising the existing agreement while also suggesting you might walk away from the whole thing, you're not creating strategic ambiguity. You're creating the impression of a government that doesn't know what it wants, doesn't have a coherent strategy, and might be talked into almost anything if the right pressure is applied. I've been watching this situation develop for months now, and I have to tell you that the pattern is deeply troubling. It's not just that individual statements have been problematic. It's that there's no discernible through line, no consistent narrative, and no clear indication of what success would actually look like for Canada in these negotiations. Compare that to the other side, where the approach has been remarkably consistent. Apply pressure, issue threats, test boundaries, and see what you can get. That's not sophisticated, but it is clear. And in a negotiation between someone who knows exactly what they want and someone who seems uncertain about their own objectives, the advantage doesn't go to the uncertain party. Every trade expert I've spoken with, every analyst I've consulted, and every historical precedent I've examined points to the same conclusion. Confusion is weakness, mixed signals are weakness, and Canada is projecting both in abundance right now. So here we are approaching the most consequential trade review in recent Canadian history, and I want to be honest with you about where things stand. The review of this trade agreement was always going to be challenging. No one should pretend otherwise. Negotiating with a larger, more powerful economy is inherently difficult, and the current American administration has shown a willingness to use aggressive tactics that previous administrations might have avoided. None of that was ever going to be easy, regardless of who was in charge on the Canadian side. But here's what's also true, and this is the part that should make every Canadian deeply uncomfortable. We are arriving at this moment in a weaker position than we were in a year ago, not because of external factors beyond our control, but because of choices made by our own government. The tariff debacle cost us credibility. The messaging chaos cost us clarity. And the apparent uncertainty about our own objectives has cost us leverage. None of those things had to happen. All of those things were avoidable. What makes this especially frustrating is that Canadians were promised something very different. They were promised expertise, competence, and a steady hand that could navigate these treacherous waters. They were promised that the unique challenges of this moment would be met with unique capabilities. Instead, what they've gotten is improvisation, contradiction, and a growing sense that the people in charge might not actually know what they're doing. That's not me being partisan. That's me looking at the evidence and calling it what it is. When your strategy requires backing down from your own announced positions, when your messaging contradicts itself from one week to the next, and when senior figures in your own camp start floating ideas like abandoning free trade altogether, something has gone seriously wrong. And Canadians have every right to ask what they elected this government for if this is the result. I want to leave you with something to think about as we head into the coming months. Trade negotiations are not just about the specific clauses and provisions that get agreed to. They're also about the signals that get sent, the perceptions that get created, and the credibility that gets established or eroded. Every time Canada has appeared uncertain, every time we've reversed course, and every time we've sent mixed messages, we've made the eventual negotiation harder. We've given the other side reason to believe that if they push hard enough, we'll give in. We've undermined the confidence of investors and businesses who depend on predictability. And we've done all of this while telling Canadians that everything is under control and that the expertise they voted for is being deployed effectively. I don't know exactly how the trade review will unfold, and I won't pretend to be able to predict the outcome. What I do know is that Canada deserved better preparation for this moment. Canada deserved clearer communication about the stakes and the strategy. And Canada deserved leadership that lived up to its own billing. As you watch this situation develop over the coming weeks and months, I want you to remember what was promised, and I want you to measure it against what's actually been delivered. Ask the hard questions, demand real answers. And don't let anyone tell you that the weakness in Canada's position was inevitable or unavoidable. It wasn't. It was created through choices, and those choices have consequences that all of us will have to live with. That's the truth as I see it, and I think it's a truth that more Canadians need to hear. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.